program. Saturdays at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. on the West Coast.
Coming up next, a news conference held Saturday at the annual convention of the American Sociological Association. Eastern Europe and the global economy was the topic of this briefing. We'll hear from a professor from the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, a professor from the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences, and a Romanian sociologist. Participants at the conference are meeting this week in Washington to discuss issues relating to sociology and public policy.
I'd like to welcome everybody to the press conference on the transform without the United States. And the way it'll proceed is each of the participants, well, 4 of the participants will make opening remarks, and then we'll open it up to the press for question and answer period, of which all 6 will participate in. We'll begin with an opening statement from Laszlo Brust, and then Jerzy Musil, and then Vladimir Tismaniano, and Emmanuel Wallerstein. And then we'll have Jeffrey Goldfarb and David Stark join in the question and answer period, and we'll begin with Laszlo.
Let me start with a very brief characterization of the nature of the problems. I think the best description comes from Polish politicians who said that it is very easy to transform an aquarium into fish soup, but the opposition, the transformation of the fish soup into an aquarium, at least will take time. There are lots of problems to be solved, internal and also international problems. I think at the level of international problems, of international economic problems, the biggest question is how these autarkic economies can be transformed into economies which are able to compete on the world market and are integrated into the system. Here, I think the basic problem is a kind of vicious circle, that the integration of these countries, of these economies into the, let's say, European level or world level economic integration presupposes changes in the economic structures and political structures, which have as a prerequisite already the integration of these economies by Western economic alliances. There are also lots of internal problems in the economy, the problems of privatization and the problem of marketization, which are not the same problems, are very different. And also the problem of the lack of a social group which would or which could serve as a social basis for economic regime transformation. Actually, these regime transformation were first of all political transformation, which opened up the way before political or economic social regime transformation, but also which gave citizenship rights, political rights for self-defense to groups which are not really interested in a rapid social regime transformation. There are also problems of the consolidation of democracy. Of course, here the problem is lies first of all with the existing patterns of mobilization of these societies in several countries in Eastern Europe. This mobilization was not based on socio-economic issues or social questions, but on nationalism or on fundamentalist issues, and these problems also have to be solved. So, very briefly, just. That's for the introduction of the nature of problems.
Well, I'm a sociologist, and I would like to stress mostly the social part of the transformation, which of course are based also on political changes, as Laszlo stressed, I think we shall indeed start with the fact that what happened in the Central East Europe can be described as democratic revolutions. I think this is this, even in technical terms, this can be used. The political changes opened changes for economy and changes even in, I would use the term anthropological changes and of course cultural. After a period of euphoria, we now soberly look on difficult decisions which must be done, and we are, in my country, we are very carefully now thinking about the trajectories of economic reforms in respect to social implications. I can just tell that we have a very lively discussion on the two possible ways how to reform the economy of the country. On the one hand, there are people who want to do it very quickly. These people who want to do it very quickly are also very often people who stress a need for demonopolization, privatization, the macroeconomic restrictive policies. They want to control the inflation, and I think they stress to a large extent also as an integral part of the reform the social policy or the social program. That's one school, and the other school is stressing the slower approach to the changes, showing to the very complicated implications of restructuring the economy. And I would say that's one of the main topics which we face. Then in terms of social and cultural problems or value orientations which we see, there is an extremely important discussion on the possibility, to use Havel's term, to combine an efficient economy with social justice. And I think this effort to combine these two ideals is at the core of the Czech, or Czechoslovak, better to say, Czech and Slovak, I must say now, Czech and Slovak endeavors to form a democratic society.
I'd say that the problem of transition from an authoritarian, some would call it totalitarian regime, in its communist version or Soviet-style version, to a democratic, Western-type, pluralistic order, includes a number of course, very exciting moments, and we have been witnessing these very exciting and euphoric moments for the latest, I don't know, 6 to 8 months or more. And there are also a number of obstacles linked to the creation or recreation, as in the case of Czechoslovakia, I suppose, of a truly democratic political culture. In some of the countries in the region, such a legacy or tradition is either conspicuously absent or really very anemic, very weak. In Czechoslovakia, of course, it's much more advanced. The second point is that I'd like to make, in addition to the fact that there are a number of obstacles, I'm going to point to one of the major obstacles, and the country I'm dealing with, Romania, is just a, I don't know, hotbed of such problems. I mean, the rise of unsolved and unresolved conflicts inherited from the communist regime or from regimes that existed there, the old order before the communist regimes. I once said, and I don't think I said something very new, but remember that my idea is that of all the evils the communist regime claimed to, or all the evils the communist regimes claimed to solve, including the problem of nationalism, the problem of ethnic conflicts and so on, instead of being resolved or solutioned along the years of communist domination, they have been only repressed, and actually their explosion now, after the communist or centrally planned economic and social system has collapsed, they are going to be with us and create extra problems that are already mushrooming in the region. The second point, and since Havel's name, President Václav Havel's name was mentioned, the second point, or the third point I would make would be the problems of morality in the region. Because if economics, the economic system, I may be too optimistic when it comes to economics, but I've worked more on ideology and morality than on economics. If the economic system has tremendous and appalling problems, I think that in terms of the morality of the people, which is the base, after all, for the resurgence of a civil society, I think that the wounds are very deep, and it's going to take a lot of time to convince the people to engage in the type of political and social and cultural participation, which is the precondition for a mature, democratic, pluralistic society. So it is not that I am not optimistic, it's just that I think that when it comes to analyzing the future of Eastern Europe, a lot of lucidity is required.
I'm all for lucidity. I would like to make 3 points. One, I think, is how we got here. This is the transformation of Eastern Europe is normally pictured as a combination of the triumph of Eastern European popular sentiment and U.S. victory in the Cold War. I would like to suggest that basically what has happened is that it is the result of U.S. weakness, not U.S. strength. The general decline of the U.S. relative position in the world system is what made possible the Gorbachev phenomenon, not simply made possible, but made it necessary. The Gorbachev phenomenon is what lifted enough of the constraint so that the people in Eastern Europe could in fact do what they have done, which was throw off the Marxist-Leninist regimes. The second point I'd like to make is that, of course, Eastern Europe is and now will be part of Europe, and that's a very important thing to remember. It will be part of Europe, not merely culturally, but geopolitically. This is not merely the expansion of Germany, as is often pictured. This is part of a new geopolitical realignment in the world, and on the European scene, I see it basically as a Paris, Berlin, Moscow axis in which Eastern Europe will be part of that European entity, the Confederation of Europe, which President Mitterrand likes to talk about, and which will, I think, come into being in the next 10 or 15 years as a kind of functioning entity. The third thing I'd like to talk about is the economic implications. Professor Bruch said they have to learn how to be integrated into the system and compete successfully on the world market. The two are not necessarily the same thing. We have many countries who have long been integrated by any definition into the system and are unable to compete successfully on the world market. Tanzania, Paraguay, etc., etc. Being integrated in the system does not mean that you have a high standard of living. And so we have to talk about what will happen in Eastern Europe. I think, first of all, the thing to say is there's going to be an enormous variation. The Czechs, not Czechoslovakia, not the Czechs and Slovenia, the Czechs may do fairly well. Slovenia may do fairly well. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria may do less well. But even being integrated into Europe, remember what that means politically and economically. Greece and Turkey are integrated into Europe. They're members of the EEC. Their standard of living is perhaps better than Bulgaria's, but it isn't Denmark's. And it isn't Great Britain's, not to say it isn't Germany's. And politically, it doesn't mean magically, even if you're in the EEC, not to speak of a vague confederation of Europe, that you necessarily have very strongly functioning parliamentary, liberal parliamentary systems. There's going to be an enormous variation, but there's not going to be any magic. Not going to be any magic, and there's not going to be a dramatic improvement in the economic situation of Eastern Europe in the next 10 years, in my opinion.
We'd now like to open up the panel for questions from the press. Let me reintroduce everybody so you can direct questions at whom you would like to. At the end, we have David Stark, who's a professor from Cornell University in New York. Professor Laszlo Bruce from the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Jerzy Musiel is from the Czechoslovak Academy of Sciences. Professor Vladimir Tismanianu, who's from Romania.
University of Maryland.
University of Maryland. Yay. Professor Manuel Wallerstein from State University of New York at Binghamton, and Professor Jeffrey Goldfarb from the New School for Social Research in New York.
Excuse me. Mr. Wallerstein, do you think the European Economic Community may eventually invite the Eastern European countries to join?
Eventually. They're going to rush into it. They've got a lot of people knocking on the door already who would like to be in. They're going to move slowly on formal integration, but there's going to be a multi-level form of integration so that they will be in the European economic orbit in one way or another without being formally with the rights and privileges of full EEC members. Maybe 15 years from now, if many things evolve, it may happen that they would actually be members of EEC. But they will be involved in, there will be a lot of pan-European institutions. Council of Europe will take on more life. Various other kinds of European institutions, maybe even military institutions, will come into existence. So I see Europe as having a panoply of structures and inner cores and sort of many circles of European power, Europeanness, European involvement. I don't know how my colleagues feel.
May I add a few words to your comment? I think the example of Austria shows how difficult it can be, even for a country which doesn't face economic problems in the dimensions we face, how difficult it is, of course, for many different reasons, not only economy, to join the big Europe. And then I think this system of overlapping groupings describes quite well the future. Now the Germans are, for example, nervous because there is a group called Pentagonal, which is composed of Italy, Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And there is a certain type of nervousness, but on the other hand, I think this overlapping, in fact, makes Europe more stable. We shall not go definitely back to this system of petite entente before the war and all this this extremely balkanized type of Europe in the interwar period. In a way, I think there is a chance of going back to a situation of the ending 19th century when Europe was approaching slowly a kind of integration, mainly on the basis of economic interrelationships. Slowly, I know that there was not an integration, but the whole process was then stopped, and the possibility to return to this situation exists, in my opinion.
If either Professor Stark or Goldfarb would want to add to the discussion, either to add the experience of any country not heard from or to make other remarks.
Say something? Since we are at the annual meetings of the American Sociological Association, say something for sociology. What it has to offer to understanding the developments in East Central Europe and what sociology has to gain from the study of these developments. The important thing that happened that came up in the panel that was held earlier this morning on opportunities and dilemmas in Eastern Europe was the following. From the point of view of popular consciousness about the recent events in East Central Europe, I mean 1989 and 1990, the general public, it appears that there was a revolution which swept through this region. Regimes were toppled, and the transition has taken place. The transition was 1989. That was the big year. 1989 is like 1789 or 1848, and it's over. Well, what sociologists, all of us on the panel this morning, were arguing was that, first of all, that the transition should be measured not in months or days or years, but probably in decades. And that the real transition, that is regime change, the consolidation of democracy, and the possibilities, prospects, and difficulties of reconstructing economies from centrally planned to market economies is going to take a long time. Now, here sociologists have something really to contribute, because from the point of view of political science, these societies all appeared, sorry, I should back up. When what we're going to see in this transition period, and what we already see now in 1990, is that there are what appeared to be great similarities in the initial set of events are actually turning out to be extraordinary differences in these societies. We don't have the consolidation of democracy in Romania, as Professor Tishmanenu argued this morning, but in fact a communist regime that's ruling in the name of democracy, but continuing to suppress and oppress the dissidents who opposed it. The differences from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. In Hungary, we have a society with a highly developed party system. In Poland, a society without a highly developed party system. In Hungary, the possibilities of consolidating democracy through the competition of parties, but in a case which it's extremely difficult in the short run to offer economic direction to the society. Whereas in Poland, we find extra-parliamentary struggles which threaten the consolidation of democracy, but because there are coalitions that extend beyond political parties, make it easier in the short run to direct the economy. Sociologists, because they study because they were already studying the differences in these societies in the pre-revolutionary, in the pre-regime transformation stage, have got some handle on explaining these differences. Now I'll be very brief. For political scientists, these regimes were the same. They were all one-party states. For economists, the regimes were more or less the same. They were all centrally planned economies. But as a sociologist on the panel this morning showed, these societies had enormous differences because the structure of civil society, that is not the state-centered focus of political scientists or the modeling arguments of economists, led them to understand that the self-organization of society in these different countries was extremely different. And I would probably invite our panelists to go back and talk again about what some of those important differences were. The absence of autonomous organizations in Romania, the presence of cultural but not political public sphere organizations in Czechoslovakia, the existence in Hungary of an alternative second economy but not an actively developed political sphere. It's probably enough about what sociologist has to contribute, and there's a lot that sociology has to learn, but maybe we should deal with that later.
If I were to characterize, first of all, my major country of interest, or the country where I speak the language, is in Poland, and since it's not represented by native, perhaps I should say a couple of words about that. Poland is distinguished. All these countries are different, are unique. That's one of the kind of humorous underlying themes of the discussion today. And Poland is unique in the sense that this goal of an autonomous civil society actually was constituted in Poland over a long period of time, from at least the early 1970s to the present, so that an alternative society, which in certain instances, especially in cultural institutions, was competitive and more dominant than the official institutions, existed in Poland, so that the transition from a society without civil society to one which is more normal, with its more autonomous public life, is not problematic in Poland as much as it is in all the other societies. I think that's very, very important to realize. Nevertheless, Poland, I think that the way to characterize the transitions in the whole region is primarily going to political grounds, and that is a transition from anti-politics to politics. That what is happening in the region is that the region is being politicized. It's being politicized both from above and from below. From above, we have an elite, the beginnings of party structures that are in fact political. The Communist Party wasn't political. There was no public deliberation. There was no confrontations of differences of opinion. It was an administered politics-like organization. And in return, the primary strategy of the opposition, most strong in Poland, but in one way or another existing in all the other societies, was a politics of anti-politics. First time I ever read that term was actually by a Hungarian novelist, George Conrad. He wrote a book called Anti-Politics. And the idea is to separate civil society, to constitute a autonomous social life, normal private life, apart from the administration of the political, but actually anti-political Communist Party. Now the struggle is of the opposition, the people from below, is to move from this sort of anti-politics, which says, leave us alone, we'll try to pretend that we live in a free society and constitute autonomous social organizations as well as we can. And now what they have to do is they have to make the transition to say, I believe this, which is different from what you believe, and we have to take that to a citizenry for vote, and we have to have laws that regulate our differences, and we have to have a way of administering the society. So they have to have, in quotes, a normal politics. As far as integration of Europe, and I think this is terribly important, it has three levels, or three primary aspects. One of the slogans of the region is that people want to live in a normal society. And that's the major goal, to live in a normal society. In economics, it means to have an economics that has some economic rationality, which means a market economy. Call it capitalist if you will, but the idea is that it has to make economic sense. The other system was a system of production for production's sake, and they have to, without regard for consumer or citizen needs or wants. Second, and that I think most of the discussion in the West, and perhaps overwhelmingly in East Central Europe as well, has centered on this transition. But there are two other aspects of the transition. That's a transition having to do with this normal society. It includes a society run by the rule of law, quite important, and with political competition, formal political competition with parties that have constituencies. Poland is odd. There's a well-formed constituency for political organization that's anti-political, that's solidarities, therefore there's a crisis, as opposed to Hungary, which has well-formed political elite, but very, very little connection between the political elite and its public and the citizenry. So that as far as this politicization in the positive sense of the region, one of the major tasks is to get the public involved in the transition, which in each society is quite problematic.
What are the prospects of civil war within these various states in Eastern Europe? We see rising unemployment in East Germany. We see
Civil war is a very strong term.
unrest.
Social unrest? Yes, but I mean, you got to put that on a comparative scale. What are the prospects for social unrest in the United States? I would say higher than in Germany. The Soviet Union is the most problematic in this term, and they may well have extensive social unrest in the next 10 or 15 years. Really depends on how, well, it depends on a lot of things. One of the things is how they resolve the national question, which is a very, very open issue now in the Soviet Union. But I think the kind of loose integration into a European geopolitical, geoeconomic entity that I was talking about is going to constrain the social unrest considerably. It's part of the price. You know, if Poland or Romania or Bulgaria wants the kind of economic benefits that come from the relationship they'll have with the EEC, they'll have it imposed upon them that they've got to constrain it. There might even conceivably, under the worst of situations, be some friendly troops to help out. I could imagine it somewhere down the road. But in any case, I think it'll be a major constraint. I would say worldwide, be less social social disruption within the European continent than in a lot of other parts of the world in the next 10 or 15 years. But I don't think it'll be zero.
Even given the ethnic differences?
Ethnic differences everywhere. I mean, you know, in a sense, the Soviet Union held a lid. Stalinism held a lid on that. The lid has come off, so we're back to normal politics, as we were just talking about. Normal politics includes ethnic differences. Have you been to Los Angeles lately? I mean, you know, it's normal.
Yeah, but still integrated within a different type of political culture. I think you'd agree, which doesn't exist at this moment, at least in countries I know something about, Romania, Bulgaria, even Hungary. And second, I don't think that, I said something again very new, our expectation is to see for the next 10 years all kind of nice social democratic and liberal democratic parties running for power in those countries. I may sound, again, a bit too catastrophic, but I think that we'll see, and here I quote from counterfront powers Ken Joey, the term, which is that we are going to see more movements of rage rather than nice social democratic parties competing there. So these have been long been repressed, a lot of tensions and complexes, if you want, neurosis, national neurosis and political neurosis and so on. And they are exploding right now, and they must explode. I mean, otherwise it's going to be just a prolongation of the old agonies. I think that we can expect, there are countries with this type of European links that are going to be much easier integrated in the European context or environment. And then you may have this kind of a political adventurist that can be a temptation in Eastern Europe, as it was a temptation in Greece for some time. And there is the possibility, even a well-integrated country, there is always a dictatorial or Peronista temptation when there is nothing to offer. But again, I don't think that there is tremendous danger of unrest that would really affect the stability of the European environment.
Well, I think one should not be too nervous, because what's going on in these countries is opening of some discussions or even some, let me say, political conflicts which were in the past suppressed. Simply, they were. There existed a philosophy or something like pretending a harmony. It belonged to the instruments, to the ideology of the ancien regime, and now people were not taught how to live with conflicts. I mean, conflict is a normal part of social life, and as a sociologist, I would accuse the past and the politicians of the past that they were not teaching people how to live with conflicts, how to have instruments for solving conflicts. And on the other hand, I would agree, or I would be a bit uneasy with the nationalistic movements or with nationalism, because I think a part of the scene there is a bit of uncertainty, and nationalism seems to me to be, in the modern time, it is an instrument for identification, and because it helps not to be excluded, so it is based on culture also, and then the stress on specific cultures is extremely out of date compared with Western Europe. In the moment when Western Europe is unifying in economic and to a large extent, I think, in other terms, Eastern Europe suddenly faces a kind of articulating special interest, and not only national. It's interesting. It is an outburst of regional, for example, identities. It's a process of a kind of fragmentation, but again, I would not only criticize it. It is an opening of autonomy, of authentic social forces which exist in the society, and there is only a need how to find the mechanisms, legal mechanisms, to enable them to exist without leading to a disaster.
Oh, sorry.
I'd like to add something to this nationalist question. I think there is a kind of refrigerator explanation for this issue. Of course, these issues were in the refrigerator for 40 years, and now you can the refrigerator exploded. The issue is open. So these transitions are, of course, in Eastern Europe also redefinitions of nationhood and redefinition of nation state. On the other hand, I would like to stress the multifunctional nature of nationalism. Nationalism was a basis for mobilization in Lithuania against communism and for democracy, or in several Eastern European countries. On the one hand, on the other hand, nationalism was a way for the a basis for the mobilization against democracy and against democratization in Serbia, in Romania, and in other countries. In other parts, so this is very context-related concept. This nationalism. It is in other. This is very much. It can be used for democracy, and also a Slovenian friend of mine, when talking about nationalism, he uses the concept of totalitarianism from below. That is, he says that while the old communist rulers have lost their capacity to control society from above. Now, by making use of nationalism in Romania, in Serbia, and in Kosovo, or in other parts of Eastern Europe, they try to control the changes via totalitarianism from below, that is, via mobilization based on nationalism.
I would just like to amplify the points made by Laszlo and Jiří. I think it's very, very important to recognize, for us in the West, not to overinterpret or negatively interpret social conflict. Essentially, the appearance of social conflict in these societies is a positive phenomenon. It's when the social conflict doesn't exist that we should really be worried. I mean, so on the one hand, we're concerned about there being unrest and that Wałęsa and his former advisors are attacking each other. We should I say we should interpret positively. That's an indication that this politicization process is going on. If it was peaceful, that would really be the problem. That would really be the problem. Now, that's not to say that there aren't nationality problems and so forth, but even in the case of nationalism, as Laszlo just pointed out, it's a form of mobilization. It's a form of mobilization which is correlated with different types of political tendencies. And it can be used as a way of integrating difference and unity. And I think that that's primarily what's happening, to use an American conception. And I think that, in fact, the American model of politics, the American type of political parties and political movements are observable in this part of the world, and I think it's a positive development.
What about the possibility or the scenarios in which these countries, or at least some of them, could become, let's say, ungovernable? Ungovernable. I mean, lack of legitimacy principles, nationalistic wars, appraisal, unemployment, and so on. Is it a possibility to consider?
It's a possibility. It's a possibility in many parts of the world. I mean, Colombia is ungovernable. Lebanon's ungovernable. There'll be more and more countries that are ungovernable. I would only say that, in fact, what I said before, that the European envelope will constrain that, because it will not be permitted. You have to be permitted to be ungovernable. That is, bigger, stronger people around you have to not interfere and let it go on, or there have to be multiple interests in conflict. And it seems to me the outside interest will be to have it to keep it within limits in Eastern Europe, and that will probably be very helpful. But I wouldn't rule it out. Yugoslavia is probably the biggest candidate for being ungovernable. Of course, they could solve that by splitting apart into 6 countries or 7 or 8 or however many they finally decide upon, but which is also not too likely. But, you know, Yugoslavia's got the problem the Soviet Union has. It set up this model confederation or federation of states with therefore state structures and all kinds of institutions, and now, which was held together by an iron hand. The minute you take over the iron hand, it isn't a very workable structure, and they've got to figure out what to do about it now.
Just in the case of Yugoslavia and Soviet Union, it would be very good if they become ungovernable, because that's the view of Soviet or Yugoslav does not exist at the moment. Slovenian, Croatian, Serbian, and Macedonian and other sociologists or social theorists that Soviet Union as such or Yugoslavia as such cannot be democratized. Armenia can be democratized. Croatia can be democratized, Slovenia can be democratized, but Yugoslavia as such, after these parts are democratized, can be democratized again, and that's the same with that holds also for Soviet Union.
I wouldn't go to the other extreme. You know, I mean, there's Switzerland, for example. You can have a governable state with multiple entities with different cultural histories and so forth. I think somewhere in between. It's very hard. It's an extra burden if you're Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union to make it because of that structure. I wouldn't rule it out, or I wouldn't rule out some reduced version. You know, one of the possibilities is that the Baltic states pull away but nothing else does. I mean, there are many. Maybe Slovenia pulls away but nothing else. I think we're in very tricky ground there. I wouldn't ordain that it's not possible to solve Yugoslavia's problems.
And the Lebanization of Yugoslavia would be very different from the Lebanization of the Soviet Union. I mean, a Lebanization where, I mean, everybody just stands around and lets them kill each other off, or lets their conflicts get so great that they are in fact unmanageable. That can happen in Yugoslavia, but it's not a possibility in the Soviet Union that Lebanization would happen, that it's just allowed to take place.
I think there are not only these pessimistic options. You can see, for example, at least on the relationship between Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, quite big intentions and effective intentions by government people to cooperate. I think, oh yes, I have proofs. Look, the Hungarians demonstrated on Charles Bridge. They were beaten. Then the Czechs arrived to Hungary. The Poles allowed the Czechs to come to Wrocław to take part at a meeting. So what I see, there is a chance of this cooperation, and the government I think what is extremely important is the economic base of it, because what one can observe, there are some, stupid obstacles which close the borders between Poland and Czechoslovakia because of the currency problems, etc. So you can observe then tensions created by very old-fashioned types of economy that it's difficult to Czechs are afraid of being exploited by the Polish visitors shopping there and buying cheaper things and exporting them as private persons. And in the moment you close the borders, then of course a normal reaction of the people is, these bad Czechs, they have closed the borders. But behind the whole scene is a non-functioning economy, and therefore I think it's extremely important to think over also not only the cultural things, but the economy of the region, and there is a danger. There is a disintegration of the old forced links between the parts like what happened just a few days ago in the relationship between the German Democratic Republic and the Czechoslovak Republic. The Eastern German government stopped to import the industrial products from Czechoslovakia. Agreed, according to the agreed. And we are losing $300 million just by this.
Hungary 600.
Hungary is in the same.
So this is part of the price of the German
So
reunification?
Yes, that are unexpected outcomes which
Another that was more expected, but just as grievous, is of course that now that the price of world oil is going up, the Soviet Union is going to charge a much higher price to the East European countries. You're going to have to pay the bill. Czechoslovakia will have, there were figures that in today's paper about the percentage, which is stunningly high, of oil that Czechoslovakia receives from. There are many prices to pay. I mean, you can no longer get the subsidy from the Soviet Union on oil.
Yes. But on the other hand, Professor Wallerstein, the Soviets owe us a lot of money too, and they changed the exchange, the exchange rate so we are, and in this respect, I think the West, I think it's extremely necessary to have a rational policy, economic policy, and not only to the small countries, but to Soviet Union. I think we shall be saved, as Havel stressed, by your help to Soviet Union, and that's a very wise thing to help them to buy our goods, for example.
As Professor Stark said, we're more likely to help the Soviet Union than Yugoslavia. And that may also apply to Czechoslovakia and Hungary. That is to say, it's more important.
Yes.
I think the Hungarian economists, if they would be represented here, they would say, first, please help Hungary, and not Soviet Union.
I didn't say help Czechoslovakia.
No, I'm kidding. No. Instead of the indirect help, that is, I'm speaking also in the name of I hope, in Czech or other economies, that they would say, instead of the indirect economic help, the direct economic help of the West would be very important. Here, I think, in a different form, the old question of Lenin comes back. His big debate with Trotsky about whether is it possible to build up socialism in one country is just alive in a different form. Whether is it possible to build up capitalism in one country? That is, and here comes the help from the West. That's the question.
Well, can I just say one last thing? I am struck, listening to us, that aside from me, no one's mentioned the United States, and I think that's important to remember. The U.S. plays, considering that it's the U.S., a relatively small role in the future of Eastern Europe. The big role is being played by Western Europe and the Soviet Union as outside entities, if you want to think of them as outside entities. The U.S. is not going to give a lot of economic aid. It's not going to be directly involved in the political maneuverings of Eastern Europe. It's going to leave that to Western Europe. It's going to be forced to leave it to Western Europe. That's important, since we're in the United States now, to underline.
I agree, except I'm sorry, you keep on thinking we're finishing. I agree with the prognosis, but as far as the analysis of the role a weakening United States played in the development of the autonomous democratization of East Europe, I think that that's fundamentally mistaken. I think that this has two sources. One, it has to do with the system malfunctions of the Soviet type and the Soviet economy and society, first of all, and second, it has to do with the long development of oppositional forces in this part of the region, and that the Reaganites are wrong to think that it was an increasing of tensions of the Cold War that caused the problem, because if it played any role, it was a relatively minor one. And the idea that the Soviets could afford Gorbachev because the United States was weakened.
Not afford Gorbachev, or needed Gorbachev.
Needed Gorbachev because the United States was weakened. It's just very hard for me to understand. I just had to add that.
Well, I'd like to thank the participants on behalf of the American Sociological Association, Professor Stark, Bruce, Musio, Teshmanyunu, sorry, Wallerstein and Goldfarb, and we'd like to thank the press for attending. And that concludes this press conference.
That concludes our coverage of a news conference held at the annual convention of the American Sociological Association. Be sure to join us Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time when we'll air a speech by political humorist Mark Russell, who is the featured speaker at a National Press Club luncheon this week. Coming up after a short break, we'll air a call-in focusing on events in the Persian Gulf that was recorded Monday evening.
Saturday on C-SPAN, political humorist Mark Russell will deliver an address at the National Press Club in Washington.